this deep dive, well, we're going to be talking about a tough story today. The story of Anabel Segura, a 22-year-old student from Madrid.
Oh, yes.
And it's a case that really shook Spain, especially back in 1993
Right.
when it happened. And, I think as we go through these sources together, we're going to really see why that is. So Annabelle was living with her family in La Moraleja,
Okay.
which is an affluent neighborhood considered very safe. People felt secure there,
Mm-mm.
almost invincible, in that kind of way.
Yeah.
Like nothing could touch them.
Yeah, I think that sense of security, that's really what makes it so disturbing. Because you're right, it's not just a crime, it's shattering that kind of perceived invincibility,
Oh, exactly. It was a seemingly normal day, April 12th, and she went out for her usual morning jog. Beautiful spring morning, quiet streets. I mean, it's that kind of routine that you just feel safe in your world.
Right.
But that routine was tragically interrupted.
Yeah, and what's even more unsettling is that it wasn't a crime of opportunity. The perpetrators in this case, Emilio Munoz Guadix and Candida Heredero, they were actually looking for a victim that day. They weren't going to work. They weren't out for a jog themselves. They were driving around La Moraleja really with a specific goal in mind.
Ugh, such a chilling thought. And, tragically, Annabelle really fit the profile that they had kind of created in their minds for their plan. They saw her, this young woman, jogging alone in a wealthy neighborhood, and they just assumed, wrongly and tragically, that she'd be an easy target for a kidnapping.
Yeah, they were really just targeting her based solely on her perceived wealth and the environment that she lived in. So it wasn't personal, which in a way makes it even more disturbing. It speaks to that level of desperation, I guess you could say, and just disregard for human life. So yeah, they forced Annabelle into their car, and this is where the story really takes that heartbreaking turn.
Yeah, and what was really striking to me, reading through these sources, was just how the family was led to believe she was still alive, clinging to that hope
Right.
while they tried to negotiate a ransom. But the reality, as we now know, is far, far grimmer. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the truth is that Annabelle was actually killed very shortly after the abduction. Emilio panicked, I think almost immediately, really. He was afraid that she'd be able to identify them, and that fear ultimately drove him to commit this senseless act.
It really is a stark reminder, isn't it, that evil can kind of lurk in even the most seemingly safe environments. And sometimes it's not even calculated malice, but just that raw, unthinking panic. It makes you wonder, can this kind of impulsive violence ever be predicted or prevented?
It's true, and I think you're right. That element of randomness, I think, is one of the most haunting aspects of this case, because it really does shatter that illusion that we can fully control our safety no matter how secure our surroundings seem.
And all this time, while all of this is happening, Annabelle's family is enduring this absolute nightmare. They received a ransom demand, and it was staggering, 150 million pesetas.
Wow.
Which is almost 900,000 euros today. Can you imagine that desperation, that agony of trying to negotiate, clinging onto this tiny, tiny sliver of hope?
Yeah, it's unimaginable. And, it's important to remember this wasn't just a private family tragedy. This case completely gripped Spain. The media coverage was constant. People were glued to their TVs, following every new development, participating in these candlelight vigils, praying for her safe return. So it really became this collective experience of hope and fear and ultimately immense sorrow. So yeah, the entire nation was just emotionally invested in this case.
It's hard to imagine the pressure that investigators were under.
Oh, absolutely.
At that time. The whole country's watching. They want answers. And for 2 years, 2 long years,
Right.
those answers were nowhere to be found.
Yeah, and the sources I've read really highlight the challenges that they faced. Emilio and Candida had covered their tracks really well, so leads were scarce, witnesses were few and far between, and that pressure to deliver results, that must have been immense.
Yeah.
So, it's really a testament to their dedication that they just never gave up.
Yeah.
Even when it seemed like the trail had gone completely cold.
That's what I find so fascinating about these criminal investigations. It's that sheer persistence, right?
Yeah.
Did the investigators ever express doubts?
Oh, I'm sure.
About finding Annabelle? 2 years is an incredibly long time.
It is.
Especially in such a high-profile case like this.
From what I've gathered, I think they always maintained some degree of hope, but really they had this deep sense of duty, not only to Annabelle's family, but to the Spanish public.
Right.
They knew they couldn't give up, not until they had really explored every single avenue. And that actually brings us to a pivotal moment in 1995, 2 years after Annabelle's disappearance. And that's when this seemingly insignificant tip comes in and changes everything.
It's amazing, isn't it, how these seemingly small details, they can just crack open a case.
Yeah.
It's like finding that one missing puzzle piece, and suddenly the picture's in focus.
Yeah.
So tell me, what can you tell us about this tip and how it led to Emilio in Canada?
Well, it wasn't this big dramatic revelation or anything, more like a quiet whisper that finally cut through all the noise. Someone, somewhere, remembered something, maybe something they'd seen or heard, a detail that seemed totally insignificant at the time, but it turned out to be crucial. And so once the investigators had that piece, they were able to put it all together,
Yeah.
connect the dots, and finally zero in on Emilio in Canada. And of course, their arrest, that brought a wave of relief across Spain, but of course, it also brought that devastating confirmation of Anabel's fate.
Yeah, that must have been such a bittersweet moment, right, for everyone involved, especially for her family. I mean, to finally have those answers, but to have those answers confirm your worst fears.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to really acknowledge the emotional roller coaster that everyone went through during those 2 years,
Oh, yeah.
the hope, the despair, the anger, the frustration. I mean, it really touched the very soul of Spain, this case. And I think that resolution, while it brought some measure of justice, it also brought this profound sense of loss.
And speaking of justice, the trial that followed, I mean, as you might expect, it was a huge public spectacle.
Right.
The whole nation's watching as Emilio and Canada face these charges of kidnapping, extortion, murder. What stood out to you about the legal proceedings and ultimately the sentencing?
I think what struck me the most was just this really stark contrast between the defendants and Anabel's family. Emilio in Canada just seemed cold, detached, almost indifferent to the gravity of their crimes.
Yeah.
And that lack of remorse, it really fueled public anger and disgust. On the other hand, Annabelle's family, while they were obviously devastated, they demonstrated this incredible strength and dignity throughout the entire ordeal. They really became a symbol of resilience, and a voice for victims of violent crime.
It's truly inspiring to see how they were able to, I guess, channel their grief into something positive, something that could prevent others from experiencing the same unimaginable loss.
Yeah, they really became powerful advocates for change, not just in terms of law enforcement security, but in terms of societal attitudes towards violence.
Yeah.
Their story is a powerful reminder that even when facing this horrible tragedy, there's always potential for growth and positive impact.
Yeah.
They chose to honor Annabelle's memory not by dwelling in despair, but by really fighting for a safer, more just world.
Yeah, and it's incredible, really, to see how they turned that tragedy into a force for good. But, I'm also curious about the broader, like, societal impact
Oh, yeah.
of this whole case. It feels like a story that would have prompted, like, serious introspection, in Spain at the time.
It really was. It wasn't just a crime story. It was a real cultural turning point. The Anabel Segura case forced Spanish society to kind of confront some uncomfortable truths about safety,
Hmm.
especially in these affluent areas that
Yeah.
consider themselves immune to this kind of violence.
So it really did challenge those assumptions of invincibility that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. People started questioning their own security, their routines, their neighborhoods. And it caused, like, a lot of anxiety, obviously,
Yeah.
but it also led to some tangible changes. There was this noticeable increase in security measures, not just in La Morale, but in wealthy areas all over the country.
Yeah.
Private security firms, I mean, they saw a huge surge in demand, and gated communities, they
Yeah.
became even more prevalent.
It's interesting how a single event can have that ripple effect,
Right.
changing not just individual behavior, but the actual, like, physical landscape
Yeah.
of a community.
Absolutely. And it went beyond just physical security, too.
Yeah.
The case also sparked all these conversations about the media's role in these types of situations.
Right.
The coverage was so intense, it was relentless, and some argued, even intrusive at times.
Yeah, it really makes you think about that balance between keeping the public informed and respecting, the privacy and the dignity
Right.
of everyone involved, especially the victims and their families.
Exactly. And in the aftermath of this case, there was a lot of debate about, like, where's that line? Should the media have more restraint? Should there be stricter regulations on reporting ongoing investigations? These were big questions that Spanish society was grappling with.
Yeah, it's a reminder that every story, no matter how tragic, has these different layers, different perspectives, and sometimes the most important conversations happen not during the event itself, but in the aftermath, as we're all trying to, like, process what happened and make sure it doesn't happen again.
Absolutely. And what's so fascinating to me is how this case continues to resonate even now. decades later.
Right.
It's part of the fabric of Spanish history. It's a cautionary tale, but also, I think, this testament to the power of hope and resilience.
So, as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from all of this?
Mm. Well, I think the most important takeaway is that even in the darkest times, even when facing unimaginable loss, the human spirit is capable of incredible things. It's capable of resilience, of growth, of positive change.
Yeah.
And I think Annabelle's family, the investigators, and even Spanish society as a whole,
Mhm.
they showed that in the wake of this tragedy, they turned their pain into purpose, their grief into action. And in doing so, they really honored Annabelle's memory in the most meaningful way possible. And, maybe that's the most enduring legacy of this case. It's this reminder that even out of profound sorrow, we can find the strength to make the world a safer, more just, and more compassionate place.
If you enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into more cases like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like the video if you found the story compelling, and share it with your friends and family who might be interested in true crime and mysteries. By subscribing, you'll stay up to date with all our latest content and join a growing community of curious minds exploring the most fascinating cases. Click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything.